This episode is sponsored by Master Class. Though it is really important to know stuff, Master Class's world-famous instructors show you how to do what's important to you. When I set out to prepare for this podcast almost exactly 1 year ago, I knew in April 2020 that I needed to get better at writing. That's where one of my favorite authors, Malcolm Gladwell, came in. Master Class makes it possible for me and others wanting to improve their writing to take a class from Malcolm Gladwell on writing at our own pace. You can watch, and in many cases listen to awesome instructors like Malcolm Gladwell teach you how to do what's important to you. You want to be a better cook? Gordon Ramsay teaches you how on the Master Class platform. You want to learn how to act? Natalie Portman teaches you on the Master Class platform. Grow yourself and support Forgotten Wars by trying Master Class for the year using the link in our show notes. Learn how to do what's important to you from the experts. Now, to our episode.
This is Forgotten Wars.
After Calais' decomposing corpse began to raise a stench in Jobert's Laher, Jobert sent Calais' corpse back to British camp on March 1, 1881. Calais' patrol jacket came with his body, but not his personal letters and papers and other personal items. Calais' wife and friends pleaded with Jobert to return Calais' personal items. So Calais' helmet was sent back to England with Major General Wood. Calais' sword, revolver, and other personal items didn't leave South Africa.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire, but that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks. Act the part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
Secretary Kimberley appointed a hero of the Second Afghan War to fill Calais' shoes in Southeast Africa on March 4th. Sir Frederick Slay Roberts, yes, that Roberts, and his staff sailed for South Africa on March 5th. Their mission? Clean up Calais' mess. Their mission terminated before it started. Cries of peace greeted them when they landed at Cape Town on March 28th. Roberts and his staff left in disgust for England as fast as they could on March 30th. Calais' stand-in, Major General Evelyn Wood, was not wild about peace either. Days after Machuba, British reinforcements continued landing in South Africa, bringing Wood's forces to 14,000. This would be more than enough to right Calais' wrongs and get the Transvaal back under control, so Wood thought. But the Gladstone cabinet's top priority was negotiating an honorable peace with Kruger, Jobert, and Pretorius. Wood and Jobert negotiated a ceasefire on March 6th, with Kruger finally getting time to vet Calais' fleeting peace offer from February 21st. Remember, the offer that Calais only gave Boer leaders only 48 hours to respond to last episode. The Boers allowed the British to send 8 days of supplies to besieged British garrisons across the Transvaal. The British government directed Wood to negotiate for peace and Transvaal self-governance as long as the Boers agreed to disperse their forces, allowed an official British resident in Pretoria to protect native African interests, and allowed British control of the Transvaal frontier and Transvaal foreign relations. Wood met with the triumvirate and Dr. Urissen on March 16th. Colonel Redfers Buller watched the negotiations as Wood's chief of staff at the time. Buller thought that Pretorius was mad to make peace, Kruger being the strong man, and Jobert being clever but not trusted by his colleagues. Historian John Laband writes, quote, Buller declared he had never seen a man with such cruel-looking hands as Joubert, and believed him when he said he would have liked personally to kill all those burghers who had remained loyal to Britain. End quote. Wood, on the other hand, thought Joubert moderate, far-sighted, and crucial to getting Praetorius and the harder negotiating Krier to agree to peace. Orange Free State President Brandt arrived as a friend to both parties a few days later to help seal peace between the Boers and the British. The Boers got their independence. The British got their suzerain rights. According to one definition, a suzerain is a strong state that controls the foreign relations of a weaker state while allowing that weaker state internal self-rule. This suzerainty became a key point of contention in the years ahead. The Boers withheld word of armistice agreements long enough to trick the British force at Potchefstroom into surrendering before they had to. This earned the Boer reputation another black mark in British eyes. The Boers tried the same ruse at Leidenberg 2 weeks later, but Lieutenant Long refused to lay his British garrison's arms down until they received word of a final peace agreement on March 30th. Other British garrisons followed a similar path. They wouldn't surrender until receiving official orders from Major General Wood or until they received an official word of a peace agreement. Long's Leidenberg garrison held on for 94 days. The Standerton garrison held on for 88 days, the Rustenberg garrison for 93 days, and the Praetorian garrison after 97 days. As long-term peace negotiations continued into the winter months, that's late June through early September for my fellow Americans, Wood stealthily bought grain and oxen just in case the Boers changed their minds about making peace. Wood tried to win 6,000 square miles of the southeastern Transvaal for Natal and peace negotiations to cut the Boers off from meddling in Swaziland or Zululand. But Wood would not win those square miles. Wood was vindicated in trying, though. The Boers intervened in the Zulu Civil Wars, annexed a third of Zululand in 1886, and made Swaziland a protectorate in 1895. Historian John Laband even argues that the Boers may never have invaded Natal to kick off the Anglo-Boer War, or even fought the Anglo-Boer War in the first place, if Wood had won those 6,000 square miles. The Royal Commission, consisting of President Brandt, Sir Hercules Robinson, and Chief Justice of the Cape, Sir Henry de Villiers, ultimately decided that the British would commit political suicide by trying to make peace and keep any Transvaal territory. Along the Transvaal's southwestern frontier, the Commission also split competing Boer and Swane land claims down the middle to try to keep peace. The British ultimately created the Bechuanaland Protectorate to block Boer expansion and keep open British access into the interior of Africa. In Episode 4, we already discussed the times the Brits and the Boers clashed against each other in the 1840s. Brits and Boers fought alongside each other in 7 of the 9 frontier wars the British waged against natives for paramountcy in southern Africa. The Boers did not impress the British with military prowess in these frontier wars. The Boers certainly didn't cement an elite reputation as warriors from 1858 to 1868 in clashes against the Basotho Kingdom. The Boers swung the door to their own annexation even wider when they floundered against Sekonkuni in 1876. They confirmed the British's low view of them as country bumpkins, as a disorganized and easily dispersed mob of fighters. So you can imagine how much Felix Scanbroecker shocked some British military leadership by what he observed commanding a mixed force with Boers during the Anglo-Zulu War. Scanbroecker served as an early siren to the British that the Boers not only excelled as mounted troops, but that each of the Boers was a crack shot, armed with the best firearms available. Scanbroecker pointed out that the Boers also knew their land intimately, incorporated excellent spies and scouts, and could easily ambush British columns. From what we saw, these warnings appear to have fallen on far too many a deaf ear. You can imagine how much Major General Sir Archibald Allison must have gagged when he had to concede in February 1881 that the Boers were probably the most perfect mounted infantry in the world. Boer commandos stood in sharp contrast to British regiments. They were very egalitarian, often to a fault. Boer warriors didn't blindly follow orders. They elected their own officers. They talked back to those officers if they didn't agree with them. Boer officers and warriors held krijgsraads, war councils, before going into action. Officer and warrior alike discussed and debated tactics openly before the officers took the final vote on a tactical plan. To head home from their regiment because they, and say their captain or colonel, didn't see eye to eye on tactics and strategy would be unthinkable to the average British private. Boer officers faced this sort of behavior quite often. If a Boer didn't like whatever plan the krijgsraad voted for, that Boer would often just head home. Imagine a soldier almost anywhere pulling something like that today. So a Boer officer fought hard to win his men's respect. Keeping that respect, and especially compliance, often became an impossible tightrope act. The Commando and Calvinism, two Boer bedrocks. The Commando system was the Boer military and economic system. The Dutch East India Company instituted the Commando system in 1715 to protect against coastal invaders. Every free burgher between 18 and 50 served for free for an allotted time as a sort of tax or civil responsibility. In emergencies, boys as young as 16 and men as old as 60 were called up. The Commando system evolved into something that focused on protecting the Cape Colony's frontier against native raiders, and sometimes a force to push deeper into southern Africa's interior. Your family, your church, and your commando. Those were your strongest social ties as a burgher, as a Boer. When trekkers kicked Cape dust off their feet, they brought the Commando system with them to the southern African interior. Any Transvaalers working as teachers, clergymen, or government officials were exempted from serving, but mandated to contribute financially towards any wars. Paying for war was relatively cheap, at least from the Transvaal government standpoint. Every Boer had to arm himself and carry 50 rounds of ammunition. Since the Boers often hunted, they bought the best firearms they could from American, British, or Swiss manufacturers. When the Transvaal rose up against the British yoke, the preferred Boer firearm was actually a British-made .450 caliber Wesley Richards rifle. They could fire this falling block single-action breech-loading rifle very accurately, up to 600 yards, over half a kilometer. If you were a Boer called to war, you had to bring your own horse, your own saddle, and your own 8-day supply of food. Black servants known as achterers accompanied Boer commandos doing the more thankless work, the cooking, guarding and slaughtering livestock, digging trenches, and so on. It was very rare that achterers were trusted or called on to fight. As we've discussed before, British officers came from the Empire's elite families with few exceptions. Boer officers normally came from the nation's wealthy classes too, and these officers typically owned lots of land. The higher a Boer officer ranked, the more responsibility they likely had in tax and government administration. The highest military position you could achieve was the Commandant General. The Commandant General in our story thus far was Piet Joubert. The Commandant General held far more than military power. This position was more than a stepping stone to higher office, but it was a stepping stone. The Commandant General fixed the prices of commodities and managed the distribution of arms and ammo from Cape, Natal, and Portuguese traders. Brave but tactically efficient men emerged in more junior officer positions, while senior officer positions usually stayed in the hands of the richest Boer families. Burghers valued living to fight another day far more than the British Army. Burghers saw little value in dying a glorious death. Burghers grew up on farms where every life, every hand mattered more than in a more urban empire. Burghers learned to live on a farm with a rifle in hand to ward off animals. Burgher boys habitually hunted by age 10. They knew not to waste expensive ammunition. Burgher life forced them into greater self-reliance, greater horsemanship, and deeper knowledge of the terrain that they hunted on. You learned to dismount your horse, fire on your enemy, and remount your horse fluidly, accurately, and rapidly. The Boers practiced storming defensive positions with fire and movement tactics beginning in the 1850s. The British bore the brunt of these tactics at Machuba, where they seldom had a chance to aim and fire at Boer assailants without accurate covering fire striking them dead. A favorite Boer tactic to be used time and time again was this: to ride rapidly in concentrated force to dead ground that offered natural cover, to fire from that dead ground, and then to do one of two things: fly to dead ground even closer to the enemy and fire from there, or remount and retreat to a better position if the battle seemed to be turning against them. Boers suffered no shame in withdrawal. Where Boers suffered was in sieges. Their mobility just didn't matter as much in sieges. This didn't matter as much when they triumphed in the First Boer War, but sieges would cost them dearly in the Second Boer War. If you would like to help keep Forgotten Wars producing and growing, would you do at least 2 of 3 things? First, would you share a link to the podcast with someone you think might enjoy it? Second, if you're listening on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or other providers, would you make sure to like or follow our podcast? If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, would you give us a 5-star rating and write a thoughtful review there? You can even do that while you're listening. Lastly, if you want more from the show, bonus episodes, behind-the-mic access, transcripts and sources, and much more, and you want to support the show, check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/ForgottenWars. That is patreon.com/ForgottenWars. The link is also in this episode's notes. Thanks to those of you who have done one of these things already. Know that you're appreciated. Now, back to our episode. The year was 1910. Brigadier General Kigel made a statement at an annual Staff College conference that sounds crazy to us today, but would not have sounded crazy to everyone in attendance. After the Second Boer War, the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902, the British War Office concluded that it was firepower that decided battles. Not swords, not bayonets, firepower. General Kigel disagreed with the War Office's assessment. Kigel declared that the War Office assessment was, quote, erroneous and was proved to be so in the late war in Manchuria. Everyone admits that. Victory is now won actually by the bayonet or by the fear of it, end quote. British armies used the Gatling gun, Maxim gun, and other automatic firearms for decades before this 1910 Staff College Conference convened. Some of you with sharp recall will remember from previous episodes that the British used machine guns to great effect against the Zulu in the 1870s. So why, in the years before World War I, was the leadership of the British turning away from maximum firepower principles towards more traditional principles? And for our show's focus, why didn't the British use automatic firepower to its full potential in the First Boer War of 1880 to 1881, or even the Anglo-Boer War nearly 20 years later? Why didn't either side use the machine gun much at all during these wars, especially compared to how the machine gun was used in World War I? Let's look at what historian Dr. Tim Travers had to say. The War Office's Special Committee on Mitrailleurs, the French's machine gun prototype, published reports in 1870 and 1871. I'll point your attention to 2 of their findings. Officers reported that the mitrailleurs could not only save manpower, but also produce decisive defensive firepower. One colonel even said, quote, I would use a mitrailleur as I would a battalion of infantry, end quote. So the Special Committee called for Gatling machine guns to be incorporated by the artillery. That was in 1871. So why were weapons so potent barely incorporated into the British Army? For one thing, the Army Council, Treasury, and Gladstone's Liberal Party did not want to sink so much money into introducing a new weapon on such a large scale. And of course, like many weapons innovations, the machine gun early on posed technical problems. Machine gun prototypes often demanded fixing. Since the prototypes were so large, they were not easy, cheap, or necessarily safe to transport, especially in the heat of battle. Many of you military history or British history buffs may be thinking to yourselves, well, the British didn't let cost or growing pains stop them from innovating their navy and keeping their navy the largest in the world by far. And you would be right. But 3 factions rivaled against each other within the British Army: the infantry, the cavalry, and the artillery, at least in much of the Victorian era. These rivals went back and forth between 2 extremes. Sometimes they rejected the machine gun wholesale and dredged up whatever flaws they could for fear that the machine gun could replace much of their manpower. Sometimes these inter-army rivals tried claiming the machine gun as their faction's own weapon. If the infantry, cavalry, and artillery arms had incorporated machine guns into their arsenals, if these three had all experimented with more tactics to make the best use of machine guns, the course of not only the Boer Wars, but also World War I would have been much different. But these what-if considerations, these counterfactuals, obviously have their limitations. In the US, for example, we can argue that any number of things would have been different in World War II's Pacific theater if there was just a US military without competing Army and Navy factions, without General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz being rivals. We cannot definitively know what would have happened with the absence of inter-service rivalry or intra-service rivalry in either case. The British Army did use the 303 and 45 Maxim machine guns sparingly against natives as they pacified southern Africa, and again in the Anglo-Boer War. By 1896, each British brigade was fitted with two 303 Maxim guns firing smokeless powder rounds. The gun alone weighed 70 pounds. They were difficult to move. Their large, horse-drawn carriages made obvious targets for Boer marksmen. Some units never used their allotted Maxims. British Maxims were typically used only in the set-piece battles of the Anglo-Boer War. The battles where both sides chose a common ground. The battles where one side didn't ambush the other. But as you've already heard, and we'll hear more about in our coverage of the coming Anglo-Boer War, the Boers excelled at ambushing their enemy. Anglo-Boer War veteran General Littleton chaired a committee in 1901 that was supposed to report on the machine gun and the pom-pom, a kind of automatic artillery gun. But the Maxim machine gun gained such a terrible reputation during the Anglo-Boer War, it tended to jam, that Littleton only reported on the pom-pom. At least that is according to historian T.H.E. Travers. However, historian Spencer Jones reportedly argues that General Littleton didn't bother to report on the small Maxim machine gun because it was going to be replaced by the Vickers gun. Wherever the truth may lay, we do definitely know that not everyone in the British Army wrote off the machine gun after the Anglo-Boer War. Major General Kitchener himself said in 1901 that, if understood tactically, the machine gun dominates the whole question of attack in the future. The lost opportunities, owing to neglect of proper tactical use of machine guns, was the most important lesson of the war. 9 years later, Major McMahon and others did argue for the efficacy of the machine gun at the 1910 Staff College Conference, saying that laying down a higher volume of fire was more decisive than ensuring higher accuracy by individuals firing rifles. But those who emphasized the negative, supposedly limiting factors of the machine gun won the day. The British War Office's Infantry Training Manual still read in 1914 that having large numbers of machine guns on the defensive line would hurt offensive mobility and lose attacking troops the element of surprise. Machine gun opponents also used the fact that the machine gun could fire high volumes of bullets against the machine gun. That same infantry training manual declared the machine gun should fire exclusively on a densely packed enemy. Ridiculous tactical requirements like these made the manual more easily because Army leadership didn't experiment with many machine gun tactics during the Anglo-Boer War. Since the Army didn't experiment with many Maxim tactics, they didn't have much to analyze systematically after the war. With so little data, less credible and more psychologically focused rationale showed up in Army manuals. After the Anglo-Boer War, the War Office focused on the wrong lessons. The War Office observed a systematic spirit of hesitancy in officers on the front lines who led attacks. The War Office wanted to see the traditional bravery of the past, where soldiers proved their character and courage by charging directly at the enemy. But the soldiers of the past seldom dealt with enemies who used trenches and other forms of cover, and had weapons that could fire just as fast, just as accurately as British weapons. So yeah, maybe officers and soldiers were a little more hesitant to make frontal attacks against the Boers. The War Office's answer? Focus on developing an offensive spirit in its soldiers. They believed the Japanese triumphed over the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War 2 years later because the Japanese had that moral superiority, that offensive spirit that got so many of them killed charging through zones of crossfire. The War Office focused on training troops eager to charge the enemy at all costs. Machine guns and increased firepower became a means to an end. The offensive, ideally the bayonet charge. Major General Haig summed this spirit up in 1907, saying, quote, "Success in battle depends mainly on morale and a determination to conquer." End quote. So in a nutshell, the British didn't use machine guns much in either of the Boer Wars because a variety of factors blinded them to their use as anything other than supplemental defensive weapons. The Boers didn't use machine guns either because of very similar thinking that underestimated the role machine guns could play in battle. The Pretoria Convention. When you hear Pretoria Convention, don't think of hundreds of government and business leaders gathering to network and listen to speeches. To be explicit, convention and treaty mean the same thing in this context. If you loyal listeners read several books about the Anglo-Boer War that followed this first Boer War, you would be able to create a word cloud where Pretoria Convention stands out as two of the largest words on that cloud. The British and Boers signed the Pretoria Convention on August 3, 1881. This convention has 33 articles. I won't do the convention an injustice by trying to comprehensively summarize it here, but you can see a link to the full Pretoria Convention of 1881 in our show notes, which you can access by becoming a Patreon supporter. For our episode today, we will rely on what historian John Laband highlights from this convention. Quote, "This convention conceded the substance of Transvaal independence while appearing to retain ultimate imperial control. It defined the Transvaal's frontiers and the extent of its debt and placed a British resident in Pretoria to represent the Queen's suzerainty. Most Transvaal Boers accepted this agreement with a bad taste in their mouths and with the hope that they could revise the Pretoria Convention's terms. The hope for the Gladstone Cabinet and other Liberal allies in England was that this convention would lay the groundwork for informal influence over and more friendly ties to South Africa. Secretary Kimberley appointed Sir Hercules Robinson to the Royal Commission charged with ensuring that post-war Transvaal would be a place of peace and stability. That post-war Transvaal would not discriminate against those loyal to the British during the First Boer War. Clamors for compensation flooded British officials. British loyalists in the Transvaal proclaimed their property damage to anyone who would hear them. The Gladstone Cabinet had promised to keep the Transvaal under British administration. So many British invested big in land and other capital in the Transvaal. Now those loyalists felt cruelly deceived by the mother country. Those loyalists demanded comprehensive compensation for property they had lost during the war and for property that had depreciated dramatically during the war. Before the Gladstone Cabinet and House of Commons even decided what to do about the plight of loyalists who remained in the Transvaal, Gladstone was burned. British loyalists gathered in the Natal town of Newcastle. They raised the British flag, the Union Jack, at half-mast in Market Square. They put Gladstone's effigy on trial. They found Gladstone guilty of high treason. So they hung his effigy. And if that wasn't enough, they burned his effigy. On April 3, 1881, a cart accompanied by a large band paraded around Cape Town. The cart carried a giant cartoon of Gladstone blindfolding the British Lion. 6,000 people gathered later that night for a bonfire. The kindling? Gladstone's effigy. They burned Gladstone's effigy 6 times across southern Africa before he finally decided what to do. In a letter, Gladstone thanked the petitioners for their loyalty, but ceded any judgments over their compensation to the recently appointed Royal Commission. While the Royal Commission did agree to compensate loyalists for any direct damage to or loss of their property, the Commission would not agree to pay for indirect loss, for property devaluation. The Royal Commission did make sure freedom of speech, religion, commercial activity, and movement were granted to Loyalists in the Pretoria Convention. The Pretoria Convention also protected Loyalists from compulsory military service. These articles were not good enough for Loyalist leaders. On the eve of the Pretoria Convention's ratification, 2,000 Loyalists held a funeral. Here is some of what was written on the coffin. Quote, "In loving memory of the British flag in the Transvaal, who departed this life on the 2nd August 1881 in his 5th year." End quote. And so on that evening of August 2nd, 1881, the Loyalists buried the Union Jack. Transvaal blacks, on the other hand, had watched in horror the past few months as it became clear that choosing the strongest dog in the fight would backfire. Chief Matsibi of the Ndebele captured the confounded feeling felt by chiefs when he said he would have sooner believed a hyena defeating a lion than the Boers defeating the British. But if white loyalists thought they faced betrayal and injustice, native supporters of the British trembled at retribution sure to strike them. Pleas for protection inundated British officials in several districts. The Transvaal Secretary for Native Affairs heard pleas from nearly every chief in the Transvaal. Various measures protecting natives emerged in the many articles of the Pretoria Convention. What those written guarantees were worth would remain to be seen. Colonel Gildea and some other British officers who survived the First Boer War got to work making absolutely certain that British soldiers were drilled to follow existing Army Field Manual instructions to a T. The existing field manual regulations around finding, constructing, and using cover against long-range rifle fire took on greater importance after their neglect needlessly cost hundreds of British lives. Some in the British Army saw quite clearly that their marksmanship fell far short of war marksmanship. But many British staff erroneously concluded that poor leadership and execution of existing tactics, not the need for better tactics, were what doomed British forces. These British staff did not neglect to emphasize to future soldiers the persona of Boers. The Boers as cheaters willing to misuse the white flag and throw rules of civilized war out the window. Sir Garnet Wolseley also feared that South Africa would learn damaging lessons about the British from the First Boer War. Wolseley feared that South Africans would think the British feared further war with the Boers, and so made peace. Wolseley feared that British military prestige stood no chance of averting future aggression in South Africa after such poor British performance in the Transvaal Rebellion. Those British loyalists who remained in the Transvaal even after being sold out would actually reap rewards, not genocide or persecution. The British government came through when the Transvaal government defaulted in paying the agreed compensation for lost and destroyed property. Business boomed after one very important discovery in the Witwatersrand in 1886. Those loyalists who stayed in the Transvaal were rewarded tenfold when the economy began to boom.